How's it going, guys? It's Crash Out MMA. I'm coming back with another video. It has been a while, but that's my bad. But I felt like this was a very important video to make. I'm going to be dropping my video about the top 15 UFC fighters of all time. Now, I thought that this was a pretty important video for me to make for two main reasons. One is that every MMA YouTuber pretty much starts off their channel or talks pretty early about their GOAT list. It's a pretty surefire way to share your opinions with people, and I have some pretty strong opinions about the GOAT list, maybe some controversial takes, but another reason I'm making this video is because one of my favorite MMA YouTubers, someone who's definitely a lot bigger in the space, posted their GOAT list, and it was atrocious. So, it was, to be honest, like, awful. I was thinking, what the hell is this guy thinking? So, you know, Lucas Tracy's GOAT list was not it. So I just wanted to talk about mine for a little bit, and hopefully you guys enjoy. And before I forget, I did want to say sorry for not uploading for a little bit. I got sick right after UFC 311, and I was sick for about 4 days, and then after that I had a lot of stuff going on in my life, so I was a little bit busy and couldn't post for a little bit. But I'm going to be back on that content grind, posting 3 to 5 videos a week, and hopefully they should all be entertaining and pretty fun to watch. Alright, let's actually get into the GOAT list now. So at number 15, unfortunately, I have Merab. Now this sucks because I'm not a huge Merab fan. He beats a lot of my favorite fighters, but I do have to admit that this guy is, if not top 15 all time, approaching it. He's on here with a little bit of recency bias, to be honest, I thought the win over Umar was very impressive, so that's part of the reason why he's on here so quickly after only 2 title wins. But, I mean, if you just take a look at those 5 names that are on the side of the screen, any bantamweight who beats those 5 people, especially with the way that he beat, like, Petr Yan and Henry Cejudo, I think deserves to be at least in this conversation. I think with this resume, he's already the bantamweight GOAT, so I think it just comes down to, do you include him top 15 yet? Because I do think he is top 20. Obviously, as you saw in the thumbnail, I'm not the biggest fan of Merab, but I do give him his props when he deserves it. And Sean O'Malley, Umar, Henry Cejudo, Petr Yan, Jose Aldo, even Marlon Moraes too. These are all great wins. And honestly, I think this guy would have more title wins if he had just fought for the title sooner. Obviously, Aljo was champ, so he couldn't do that for a while. But I think that this guy's cardio is nutty. Maybe even the best in UFC history. And I think that's part of why he's such a good fighter. He's able to weaponize that cardio more than I think anyone ever. That Umar performance really impressed me. Because to be honest, I thought he was going to get destroyed by Umar. I was not. I thought Umar was going to 50-45 this goofball. And I'm kind of sad that he didn't. That being said, Merab just showed levels. Merab showed why he's the machine. And I do think he deserves to at least be considered for the top 15, like the lower spots on this list. Obviously, I'm not a huge fan of this guy, just the way that he fights. But I have to give him his props. He's definitely a very good fighter. And I was impressed with his last couple of performances. 48-47 performance against Sean O'Malley. It was a lot closer than some people give it credit for, but he clearly beat a guy in Sean O'Malley who I think is the best striker in the division, and doing that to that level of guy I think is very impressive. And I think that with all of these different wins, Merab for sure deserves to be at least in the top 20, as I said. I have him at number 15 just because I was struggling to find someone who actually was at the number 15 spot if it wasn't Merab, other than like these old head guys who literally fought bums. So I think that Merab being at number 15 is sort of perfect. I think he definitely has so much more potential. Just his cardio, his wrestling, I think he definitely has the potential to be a guy who gets pushed up into that sort of top 10 conversation. I don't really see too many people in the division giving him problems after he disposed of Umar that easily. So because I thought Umar was going to be his nightmare matchup, and he showed that he beat him. So, personally, I think Merab definitely has room to grow, but I think I have him pretty fairly rated right now at number 15. Okay, but moving on to number 14. At the number 14 spot, I have Ilia Topuria. I think if you're rating him higher than this, you're just letting your recency bias kick in. Here's the thing. Ilia Topuria might be one of the most skilled fighters we've ever seen in the octagon, but we don't necessarily know that for sure just because he hasn't faced elite competition enough for us to say that. I think he's definitely getting there after the Max win, but when you look, like if I those four that I have listed under his best wins, Volk, Max Holloway, Josh Emmett, and Bryce Mitchell, those are his only four good wins in the UFC, like top level. And Bryce Mitchell and Josh Emmett are pushing it, let's be honest. Don't get me wrong, Volk and Max are both top 10 guys all time. And having a knockout win over both of them, especially over Max, is super impressive. That being said, if you have 2 elite wins and 4 total good wins, even if you are undefeated, super, super skillful when it comes to the boxing and even the grappling, I can't put you higher than how I have him currently ranked because he just hasn't proven himself yet. Now, out of everyone on this list, I'd say Ilia Topuria has the most potential. Like, I could see this guy being top 7, top 5 all time in the future with just like 3 or 4 more wins. But as he is right now, 16-0, only a few good wins in the UFC, only a few total fights in the UFC. Granted, this guy has looked sort of unbeatable throughout his career, but with only 2 title wins, I can't rate him higher than this. Don't get me wrong, though. I definitely think that this guy is already one of the greatest fighters of all time. And the fact that he only has 2 title wins and 2 elite wins, and he's already up in this conversation of like top 20, top 15 all time, just shows how much of a monster this guy is, being able to so quickly get into that conversation. But when you knock out 2 guys that were the number 1 and number 2 guys all time in your division back to back in the same year, and one of them never having been knocked out before, that's super impressive. So Ilia Topuria, I think, deserves this spot. I think he's over Merab. They have the same amount of title wins, but I just overall think that Merab doesn't have anything really at all that compares to Volk and Max Holloway. But yeah, number 14 all-time, pound for pound, I have Ilia Topuria. And coming in at the number 13 spot, we have Kamaru Usman. So, Kamaru Usman, I think some people would say I'm rating him a little too low. Others might even say I'm rating him high. I don't know if anyone would really want him to be outside of the top 15, but some people have him like much higher. You know, there's some people who have him like top 7, which, let's be honest, those people need to get on some meds. But Kamaru Usman is definitely one of the most elite fighters ever. I think he's the second greatest welterweight of all time, just behind GSP. Like, this guy is just one of the most dominant champions we've had, at least when he was on his win streak. Obviously, he had that 15-fight win streak, almost tied Anderson Silva's, and he was fighting much more elite competition in the welterweight division at that time. And to be honest, he has a great resume. He has 6 title wins, which isn't the most, but he has some high-quality wins. Tyron Woodley, so people don't really rate this win, but 50-44ing a guy like Tyron Woodley is super impressive, especially considering that Tyron Woodley is probably the 3rd best welterweight of all time. Heavily, heavily underrated and talked about guy. Like, this guy is a guy who was beating Robbie Lawler's and beating Stephen Thompson's, and he was one of the best UFC champions at that time. And Kamaru Usman went in there and demolished him, and then picking up wins twice against Colby Covington, against Gilbert Burns, Jorge Masvidal. He technically had 2 fights against Jorge, but one of them was short notice. But knocking out Jorge in the way he did was super impressive for me. Even though Jorge isn't like the most elite fighter, I think that Kamaru Usman made it look easy, and I just think that that was a very impressive win. And then This is a win that a lot of people forget that Kamaru Usman has, but he has a win over Sean Strickland, which at the time was not necessarily insane. It was a good win at the time, but it's just aged like fine wine, with Strickland obviously doing amazing things at middleweight right now. So, personally, I think that Kamaru Usman definitely deserves this spot. You could maybe bump him a little bit higher. Like, I could see bumping him above the next guy just because he's a little bit more proven. I am a fan of the fact that this guy actually had a title reign, like many defenses. Not many, but enough. And yes, he got KO'd by Leon Edwards and then had that close fight with Leon and Hamzat. But really, out of his 3 losses in the UFC, all three of them were very close fights. Obviously, the second fight against Leon, he was dominating and then got head kicked. The third fight against Leon, people don't talk about it. I think that fight could have been a draw. It was incredibly close. People like to talk about it as if Leon beat him a lot more convincingly than he did, but it was a very close fight. And same thing with Hamzat Chimaev. Kamaru Usman has had the best performance that we've seen anyone have against Hamzat, except maybe Gilbert Burns. He went up to middleweight on short notice and arguably had a draw against a guy in Hamzat Chimaev who went out there, dumped his gas tank, and then Kamaru Usman showed how much of a crafty vet he is going in there and winning the next 2 rounds. So, to be honest, I think this guy definitely deserves props. I think this guy definitely deserves to be in the top 15 all time. One of the best welterweights of all time. Yeah, man, I can't justify leaving him out. But anyway, moving on to the next one. At number 12, somewhat controversially, I have Alex Pereira. So, the reason why I feel like this might be controversial is because he's been in the fight game for such a short amount of time. Like, this guy, I believe, started fighting professionally in MMA like 4 years ago. And he's already a superstar, multi-time UFC world champion. And I think that he's top 15 all time as well. Now, with Alex Pereira, it's weird because obviously he had a lengthy kickboxing career before he started MMA. So that kind of plays a little bit of a factor in the fact that even though it says 12-2, he's obviously a lot more experienced than what his record might let on. And that's shown by the fact that almost all of his fights recently have been title fights. So, that being said, he also has a pretty good resume as well. You know, fighting at middleweight and at light heavyweight. His best work has been at light heavyweight, but he has great wins against some elite guys. He has 2 wins over Yuri. Those are aging better after Yuri just destroyed Jamal Hill. So, you know, especially the second one where he just completely demolished Yuri. The first one was a close fight and a little bit of an early stoppage. He also has a win against Jamal Hill. Both of these guys are former champions. And Jamal Hill, I guess there was some controversy with that win. But overall, like, he just knocked out Jamal Hill in the first round. And I think it would have happened regardless of the Herb Dean stoppage or not, because Alex was walking him down anyway. He has a win over Israel Adesanya, who is a guy who I consider to be top 25, top 30 all time. And he knocked out Izzy in the 5th round, or TKO'd him, which was a pretty impressive win, obviously, because that was that would have been his 7th MMA fight. And he beat a guy in Izzy, who was one of the top fighters at that time. And this was before the Strickland fight, so he had a lot more aura than he does now. So, and then knocking out Sean Strickland. People don't talk about this, but this win aged incredibly well. He knocked out Sean Strickland, who then went on to beat Israel Adesanya, beat Paulo Costa, have a super close fight with Dricus du Plessis. So that win aged well. And then Jan Blachowicz, that's another former champion that he went in there. Obviously, that was a fairly controversial split decision, but he went in there in his debut at light heavyweight, a few months after getting knocked out by Izzy, and had a good performance against Jan and outstruck him pretty cleanly. And Jan is a guy who outstruck Izzy. So, when you look at Alex Pereira's resume, especially if he beats Magomed Ankalaev, put him top 10. Like, this is a guy who has done some amazing work at light heavyweight. Like, if you just look at his title run in isolation, like his title reign, he has some amazing defenses, and he fights often. His skills are also elite. Like, he's one of the best kickboxers we've ever seen in the cage. Tons of power. I just don't see why you wouldn't include this guy in your top 15. Now, I was talking to a friend of mine recently. This is more of a side note, and we were talking about how difficult it is to rank Pereira. You know, with such a short time in the UFC, it's very difficult to put him on a scale with a lot of guys who have like double his fights. And although that's the case, when you really think about it, it's about resume and skills. And obviously, he has the skills. We've seen that through his kickboxing career and into some of his more recent fights. And the resume that he has, he's beaten so many former champions: Yuri, Jamal, Israel, Sean Strickland, Jan Blachowicz, even guys that are not necessarily that elite level, but still definitely very good, like Khalil Roundtree. That's, people don't really talk about how good of a win that is. Khalil is a guy who looked completely leveled up and was actually giving Alex trouble, and Alex was able to go in there in that fourth round, I believe, and just dismantle him. Looked like he was in the Matrix, slipping all of his shots, countering. So he's very skilled. He has the resume, and although it is kind of difficult to put him on this list just because of the fact that there's people with much more built-up resume, I feel like, honestly, Pereira's resume kind of reminds me of if you were to take a great champion like John Jones and just cut off their climb up to the title and only include their title wins and top elite wins. And I feel like that's sort of what his resume is like. And those gaps are filled in by his kickboxing career. And obviously this is MMA, so you can't take that into account too much. But call it recency bias. I just can't see this guy not being top 15 all time. And coming in at the number 11 spot, we have Jose Aldo. Now, some of you might find me a little bit crazy for not putting him top 10. I know there's a lot of old heads who like to throw Jose Aldo in that top 7 sort of conversation. I think he's dropped, but I think Jose Aldo is a guy who's always going to be in the sort of top 15 conversation. Not only just because of his elite wins that he had during his title reign at featherweight, but when you look at the fact that he was able to drop down in weight later and compete while he was an older guy, you know, late 30s, and still compete with bantamweights who obviously have the lighter man's skill against him, and he was, because he was a featherweight coming down, and he was still able to pick up some high-level wins like Marlon Vera, Rob Font, Pedro Munoz, and even more recent wins like, I know Mario Bautista technically beat him, but realistically Jose Aldo beat Mario Bautista before he got robbed, and Jonathan Martinez. So this is a guy who just shows immense longevity. He has great wins against sort of the earlier guys in the featherweight division, you know, your Uriah Fabers, your Chad Mendez, your Frankie Edgars of the world. And I think, honestly, that the amount of title wins that he got, being 11, is impressive in and of itself, regardless of the fact that he has less elite competition than some of the other featherweight champions that we're going to talk about in a second. But overall, I just think that Aldo's skills, I think his resume, and just his longevity has been super impressive throughout his career. And I think all of that put together, you kind of have to put him in this sort of close to top 10 area. I wouldn't even be mad if you put him top 10. If you start putting him in that top 7, you're pushing it a little bit. But Jose Aldo is for sure one of the greatest of all time. And breaking into the top 10, at the number 10 spot, I have Anderson Silva. Now, these old heads, these UFC boomers are going to get mad at me for throwing this guy not in the top 5, but the reality is this guy has lost 11 times. You know, he had that huge losing streak at the end of his career. Now, a lot of people, when they're talking about Anderson Silva, they'll talk about prime Anderson Silva, man. That guy was different. He was a different beast. And I agree to a point, but you can't only look at a fighter in their prime when you're ranking them as a GOAT. You have to take their losses into account. Otherwise, it would be way more difficult to rank people, because then you basically are just going to be ranking a bunch of guys who had undefeated streaks in their prime against other guys who had undefeated streaks in their prime. So I think you have to take those losses into account. And it wasn't like he was super old when he was losing these fights either. He was mid 30s when he had all those losses. And yes, he fought till he was 40, I believe, or maybe even past 40, but he was washed only like a couple fights into that losing streak. What I'm trying to say is, although he did sort of start losing towards the end of his career, it wasn't necessarily just because he was old, because he was fighting guys that weren't even that much older than him. So for me, Anderson Silva is a guy who had a very, very good prime. Obviously, the 16-fight win streak, the 10 consecutive title defenses. But when you look at the guys that he fought, I think it's difficult to rank him top 5 or top 7 all time just because of, Vitor Belfort, Forrest Griffin, Rich Franklin. These are guys who, don't get me wrong, are definitely good wins. But they're not elite. And that's just because there wasn't nearly as elite of competition back then in Anderson Silva's time as there is now. Now, don't get me wrong, prime Anderson Silva is definitely one of the most skilled fighters we've ever seen. His striking was incredible, and obviously he had great grappling moments like when he submitted Chael Sonnen. But at the end of the day, you can't really rank him higher than this just because the quality of the wins isn't there. If you know, like, his title reign is almost deceptively long in the way that he has 11 title wins, 16 fights in a row, but a lot of the guys that he's fighting are cans, you know what I mean? So you kind of have to look at it through a lens of modern UFC guys being just much tougher competition. So when you stack him up against some of the more modern fighters, I just don't think you can keep him in that sort of top 5 sort of conversation just because of that fact. That being said, I do think that this guy is incredibly skilled. Watching him back then was sort of like an unmatched feeling of watching him knock people out. So I have Anderson Silva at number 10. I think he deserves to be here. He's above people like Aldo for me just because title wins and win streaks do matter in some capacity. They're not like useless or anything. So I definitely think that this guy deserves his top 10 spot all time. It's just, I know that a lot of people have him a lot higher than this. I personally disagree though, and I think he is perfect around this number 10 spot. Moving into 9th place, breaking out of the top 10, we have Max Holloway, the second greatest featherweight of all time. We'll talk about Volk in a second, but Max Holloway definitely deserves this top 10 spot, in my opinion, because a lot of his wins are very impressive and aged well, too. So he had 2 wins against Jose Aldo to get into it, and yes, Jose Aldo had lost to Conor McGregor at that point, but you can't forget that before Max beat him, Jose Aldo beat Frankie Edgar for the title. So it's not like Jose Aldo was washed, but Max beat him twice and just sort of melted him with volume and showed his impressive style. Another impressive win, more recent, Justin Gaethje knocking out a guy like that after dominating him for 5 rounds, after moving up a weight class. It was a very impressive performance. Justin Gaethje, obviously an elite lightweight, so I rate that win pretty highly, even though it is pretty recent. Anthony Pettis, Brian Ortega, Frankie Edgar, these are wins that are maybe a little bit less in quality than the other two. But, for example, we were talking about Anderson Silva being number 10. Anthony Pettis, Brian Ortega, Frankie Edgar, those are wins that are better than most of the wins on Anderson Silva's resume. And Justin Gaethje and Jose Aldo are better than all of the wins on Anderson Silva's resume. And yes, Max has lost a couple of times, but when you look at his losses, he lost to Dustin Poirier in his debut. He was young. He didn't really know how to grapple at that point. He lost to Conor McGregor, yes, but these were all sort of young Max. And that sounds like a rapper name, Young Max. But no, he goes out there and loses to Dustin Poirier at lightweight on short notice. And obviously he loses to Volk 3 times, one of which I could argue was a robbery. And it's only really those 2 guys, and then obviously recently to Poirier knocking him out. But there's no shame in that. You know, he was moving down a weight class. Ilya is one of the most elite fighters we've seen at featherweight in years. So it's not like an Anderson Silva type of thing where he was winning, and then he started facing tougher competition and sort of lost a bunch of fights in a row. He's still elite. Honestly, I would pick this guy to beat a lot of the lightweight division right now. So Max Holloway, I definitely think deserves this top 10 spot. Honestly, I don't see how you would keep him out of it. Yes, Topuria did beat him, but just because Topuria beat him doesn't mean that Topuria is above him in the GOAT list, if that makes sense. At number 8, we got DC. So, honestly, I think this one's pretty standard. You know, DC top 10. He has some great wins, obviously being a double champ. He beat Stipe, Anthony Johnson twice, Gus, and Derek Lewis. Derek Lewis I kind of have on here as a joke one because I wanted 5. And, you know, not getting knocked out by Derek Lewis is impressive. But that being said, I think that DC is definitely deserving of this spot. You know, elite wrestler, one of the most elite wrestlers we've ever seen. Very, very good at sort of that dirty boxing style. And I just think that a lot of his wins in the light heavyweight division are some of the best that we've seen in that division. And honestly, I think if it isn't for John Jones, if John Jones didn't exist, this guy could have been the GOAT. He could have beat everybody and had like a long title reign. And then obviously he moved up to heavyweight and had those fights against Stipe. He beat Stipe, and yes, he did ultimately lose to Stipe. But you also have to remember that Stipe was the bigger guy. He was at heavyweight, and this was Stipe before he was washed. A lot of people are remembering Stipe as he was in his last 2 fights, but this was Stipe back in 2019, 2020. A lot more skilled, a lot more physical, and like physically capable of fighting. And his only other loss than the 2 Stipe losses are to John Jones. I'm not counting the no contest one as a loss. You know, it's a no contest for a reason. So DC really only lost to 2 guys who are considered GOATs. Stipe is obviously considered the heavyweight GOAT, and John Jones is considered by some to be the GOAT, and those are the only 2 people he's lost to. And he's had a title reign of his own, became a double champ, beat guys like Gustafsson, which is a very good win actually, even though he sort of isn't really looked at that much. And Anthony Johnson too, having 2 wins over a guy like that is pretty impressive. Just watching this guy who was just sort of always a wrestler become sort of more well-rounded. I just think that Daniel Cormier, his skill set, his resume, I definitely think he deserves to be number 8. At number 7, we were just talking about him, I have Stipe. So, I think Stipe is slightly above DC just because he beat him twice. I think if you're going to beat someone twice, that puts you above them, at least at a high level. And I guess there could be exceptions to that, but I think that Stipe is the heavyweight GOAT. I think he's a little bit higher than DC just because I think that his title run was at heavyweight was a little bit more impressive than DC's at light heavyweight. And obviously he has great wins. He has 2 wins over DC. He has a win over Francis Ngannou, which a lot of people forget. They do remember Stipe getting knocked out by Francis, but not a lot of people remember the fact that Stipe fraud-checked Francis originally when they fought for the title. He beat Fabricio Verdum and JDS, both of which are great wins in the heavyweight division. So this guy is definitely deserving of the top 7 spot, just because of the fact that he's not only the GOAT of his division, but he's beaten another guy who is top 10 twice. You know, having wins over guys in the top 10 is very impressive. We talked about that with Topuria earlier. The guy only really had 4 good wins, but 2 of them were against top 10 guys, and that immediately puts you in the conversation of being on this GOAT list. And in addition to that, he has the title reign of beating multiple powerful, dangerous guys at heavyweight. I think that he's one of the best fighters to ever walk the face of the earth. I think Stipe is heavily underrated. I honestly don't rate his last fight at all against John Jones. I don't consider that in his legacy at all, just because, let's be honest, he was only there for a paycheck. He walked in, he was slow, and just got dominated by a much faster and a younger guy. So he was like 43 years old. I don't really consider that loss too harshly against him. And the guys that he's losing to are elite anyway. Francis Ngannou, JDS, and obviously he lost to Stefan Struve, the giant guy. But that was early in his career. So Stipe, very well-rounded, great boxer, great wrestler. I just think that this guy definitely deserves more props, and I think he's deserving of this number 7 spot. At number 6, we have every 2019 fan's GOAT, Khabib Nurmagomedov. So, this honestly is more standard now. Years ago, he was much higher on the GOAT list, but I think at this point, you have to look at him and realize, most of his wins were outside of the UFC. Yes, he's undefeated, 29-0, which is very impressive, but when you have 16 wins outside of the UFC, it's much easier to remain undefeated for that long. And I'm not going to diminish him by his accomplishment of being undefeated. It is still very impressive, but you do have to remember it's not like he had a 29-fight win streak at the UFC or against top-level competition. A lot of the guys he was fighting early in his career were cans when you actually look into it. That being said, he does have some very good wins. Dustin Poirier, Justin Gaethje, Conor McGregor. Conor McGregor is a guy who, at the time, was a very, very elite fighter. And because people forget from all the antics and stuff from Conor that he was a double champ and Khabib beat him. And, of course, RDA. Staying undefeated, beating all these guys. His style was very unique. He was definitely that sort of stereotypical Dagestani just wrestler, and he would just smother guys on the ground, out-cardio them. He was just a very impressive fighter. All of his performances were dominant. He barely ever even lost rounds, and I just think that he deserves to sort of be higher up on the list. Even though he's not top 5, I think he's falling slightly just due to the fact that I don't think he's the lightweight GOAT anymore. He retired early is the thing, because who's to say he wouldn't become the GOAT with a few more wins if he had stayed fighting. But overall, I think that Khabib staying undefeated, picking up wins at lightweight against pretty elite level guys, I think he deserves to be high up on the list at number 6. Breaking into the top 5, at number 5, we have Mighty Mouse, Demetrius Johnson, DJ, whatever you'd like to call him. But I think that Mighty Mouse definitely deserves to be in the top 5, Joe Rogan calls him like the most skilled or like the best expression of martial arts. He's one of the most skilled fighters we have ever seen in the octagon, at flyweight in a division where skill is sort of everything. And he has some pretty good wins, but obviously, just the craziest run of having 11 consecutive title defenses. He has wins over guys like Henry Cejudo. Adriano Moraes was in one championship, and obviously he was a champion and won as well. But I rate that win pretty well as well, because I think Adriano is definitely a good fighter. That's why I have the sort of asterisk next to the fact that he has 15 title wins, just because he only has 12 if you include the UFC ones. But I include the one championship ones because it is technically a world championship title. And overall, when you look at this guy's record, the guys that he's lost to, there's no shame in losing to him. He lost to Dominic Cruz when he was fighting one weight class up as a young guy, so that he wasn't in his prime yet. He lost to Henry Cejudo, but that was obviously a very close split decision that I honestly think DJ won. He lost to Adriano, but he beat Adriano 2 more times after that. So you can't really complain too much about the guys that this guy's lost to. And obviously just having one of the most insane title runs in UFC history with 11 consecutive title defenses. Now, a lot of people rate him lower. You know, Lucas Tracy literally didn't even have him top 10, just because a lot of the guys that he's beating are that he beat are people that really aren't that elite or aren't very good, just because the flyweight division has never been all that deep. That being said, the way he was beating people, you know, doing that suplex flying armbar on Ray Borg and just showing off his full skill set, I can honestly say that he deserves to be top 5 just off of the skills he showed and just off of just the sheer volume of title wins that he had. Even though they weren't against the best competition, I think he showed within his division pound for pound skill, which is really what we're ranking here, is pound for pound fighters. So I think pound for pound, this guy being such a lightweight class, I think he was able to show just athleticism and skill at the highest level, and I think he still deserves to be in the top 5. He's retired now, but, you know, still going strong, doing gi jiu-jitsu. I think this guy definitely is in the top 5 all time. At number 4, call it recency bias, call it whatever you want, I have Islam Makhachev. This guy is on a 15-fight win streak. He's the greatest lightweight of all time. He has some of the best, a little typo there with his title wins, but he has some of the best wins against guys sort of in his division ever. You know, I think he's the greatest lightweight of all time. I think he's beat out Khabib. He has wins over guys like Charles, Dustin Poirier, Moicano. A lot of people don't rate that Moicano win. People forget that Moicano is elite. He's a great fighter, you know. He was a high-ranked contender at featherweight. He's fought and beat a lot of very good guys. He was on a win streak, and he was a great grappler. He still is. Jiu-Jitsu black belt, and Makhachev was easily able to submit him in the first round, which is super impressive. He beat Volkanovski twice, and Volkanovski is a guy who is a top 5 fighter of all time. So I rank those wins highly, even though one of them sort of has the asterisk of being on short notice, you know, a weight class up. But still, being able to knock out Volk like that is impressive. And then the Dustin and Charles wins are just guys who have been mainstays at lightweight, very skilled guys. He made Charles look easy, you know. Charles is one of the best lightweights of all time. Great fighter, great grappling, dangerous submission threats, and he dropped him and submitted him pretty easily overall. Dustin Poirier, he outboxed Dustin Poirier. You know, he was striking for most of the fight with Dustin, outboxed him, and then managed to take him down in that 5th round and get the Darce choke and submit Dustin, which was impressive in and of itself. I just think that Islam's resume overall, I think, puts him in the top 5. If he can beat Arman and then beat somebody at welterweight to win the title, I think he becomes the GOAT, to be honest. Like, he's right there. He's almost tied Anderson Silva's win streak. To be honest, I just think that Islam Makhachev is one of the most... Like, let's be honest here. This guy is incredibly well-rounded. People like to think of him just as a wrestler, but this guy is an incredibly good striker. You know, knocking out Volk, knocking down Charles, outboxing Dustin. he's one of the most well-rounded fighters we've ever seen. Because obviously he still has that elite ground game that the Dagestanis have. I think he's more skilled than Khabib, even though Khabib maybe had slightly better grappling. Islam's striking is just an entire level up, and he still has the conditioning of having great cardio, being very physically strong. I think he's sort of the perfect, if you could craft a fighter, he's almost like the perfect fighter to be in this sort of GOAT conversation. Lightweight, and I think he deserves to be top 5. He has a ton of potential to become the GOAT. He's still pretty young, and he only needs 2 or 3 more wins, in my opinion, to become the GOAT. So keep your eye on Islam. He definitely deserves his top 5 spot. It's not even recency bias. It's just the quality of his wins, the way he's beating people, the skills that he's showing. He deserves this spot. At the number 3 spot, and this is one that I know is going to be controversial, but I have Alex Volkanovski at number 3. I think that he is one of the greatest fighters of all time. People don't understand how impressive it is beating Max Holloway 3 times, and not just beating him, but in that third fight, schooling him. Max is a guy who is top 10 all time, in my opinion, and Volk beat him multiple times. And he beat Jose Aldo, and he beat guys like TKZ, Yair, Brian Ortega. You know, he's the greatest featherweight of all time for sure, even though he lost it to Poirier. But to be honest, I think it's hard not to put him top 5. It's hard not to put him top 3 just because the quality of his wins is so high. And he had a pretty dominant reign as featherweight champion, and he got a little bit old. His chin isn't as good, obviously, since he got knocked out by Islam. And going into the Topuria fight, I was telling people that if Volk beats Topuria, which I didn't pick him to do, but if Volk beats Topuria, he passes GSP. You know, he beats out some of the best fighters of all time just because of how incredible of a win that would be. And yes, he lost to Topuria, which is the reason that I have him firmly at the 3 spot, but there just isn't anyone that can contend with being 26-4 against guys like 6 title wins at featherweight is impressive. You know, Jose Aldo has a lot more, but the quality of people that Volk is beating, Max Holloway, Aldo, Yair, Brian Ortega, these are all guys, like Brian Ortega and Yair are people who are, and Max, are people who are all still in the top 5 at featherweight right now. And Jose Aldo is another guy, along with Max, that I had on this list already. So, personally, I am strongly opinionated towards the fact that I think Volk deserves to be top 3. If he can beat Topuria in the rematch, he's the GOAT, okay? Like I said it. Volkanovski has shown to have some of the best fight IQ, the best striking, the best sort of ability to make adjustments, as we saw in the second Max fight. Overall, I just think that Volkanovski deserves to be at the number 3 spot. But we will move on to the top 2. At number 2, I do have GSP. I don't know why this image is so weirdly low poly, but it's okay. GSP, you know, everyone kind of knows is in that sort of top 2 conversation. Some people have him as the GOAT, you know, because he's a clean athlete. We'll talk about John Jones. And some people have him sort of at that number 2, number 3 spot. But I think his welterweight title run is definitely very impressive. He's beat everyone he's ever fought. You know, he's avenged the losses that he's gotten. And to be honest, I thought the Matt Serra loss is kind of fluky anyway. Double champ as well, beat Michael Bisping to get the 185 belt. Wins over guys like BJ Penn, Carlos Condit, Johnny Hendricks. These are all very good wins. And the level competition he fought, in my opinion, wasn't as good as like Kamaru Usman. But I think the fact that he had a way more dominant title run and title reign than Usman puts him as the welterweight GOAT. And I think of him a lot like a Volk. You know, he has some wins against guys like BJ Penn, Johnny Hendricks, Michael Bisping that are good, but the fact that he's pretty much not had any bad losses and he stayed skillful, well-rounded, and not undefeated, but like I said, avenged all of his losses and beat everybody else. I think it just puts him at this number 2 spot. He's a very good grappler. He's a great striker. Great fight IQ. I mean, when you listen to this guy talk about, his game plans and all of that. And I just think that he, in the welterweight division, has been able to show before he retired that he's one of the most skilled fighters of all time. I think his resume speaks for itself. 13 title wins, 13 fight win streak. I think he deserves all the props. I don't think he's really overrated. He's a clean athlete too. He's never popped for anything like Anderson Silva has or some other people have. So overall, I think GSP is pretty clearly at the number 2 spot. I don't think this is controversial at all. And I don't think the next thing is controversial either. At the number 1 spot as my GOAT of the sport, sadly I have Jon Jones. Jon Jones is the pound for pound number 1 fighter of all time. If you put Jon Jones in the room with anybody, Jon Jones walks out. Unless Diddy is in the room with him. But Jon Jones is 28-1. Obviously, the one loss to Matt Hamill isn't a real loss. But then again, he did cheat. And also, he did lose a fight against Dominic Reyes and got gifted a robbery decision. One of the most ridiculous robberies I've ever seen live. But it's up there with Gane versus Volkov. It's up there with some of the worst ones. So, Jon Jones, I'm not a huge fan of the guy, but you have to look at the fact that he has 16 title wins, long win streak. He hasn't been beat pretty much since the Matt Hamill fight on paper, and like Anthony Smith. But, the no contest against DC, I don't really count as a win. Yes, it was a very impressive performance, but he popped for steroids, You can't use performance-enhancing drugs and then just have us ignore it and pretend like you didn't. It's a no contest for a reason. If it didn't matter, they wouldn't have made it a no contest. But that being said, he does have a win over Gus. He has 2 wins over Gus, but I think the second one is way more impressive, knocking him out like he did, whereas in the first fight it was definitely close. And obviously a win over DC, Glover Teixeira, Lyoto Machida, and Shogun Rua. He's the youngest champ of all time. I think Jon Jones is pretty firmly at the number 1 spot for now. I don't really rate the Stipe or Gane wins because neither of those guys are really elite heavyweights. But that being said, I do think that, or at least they're not elite heavyweights right now. That being said, though, I do think that Jon Jones is the GOAT. I could see him being passed up in the near future. In the next 2 years, if Islam keeps winning and Topuria keeps winning and Pereira keeps winning, I could actually see them overtaking him. I could see him losing his next fight if he fights Tom Aspinall and dropping below GSP. But I think for now, there's nobody better than Jon Jones just because he has the wins over top guys all time like DC, and he also has just the lower quality but like high quantity wins with all his title defenses. 16 title wins is insane when you really think about it. There's some guys on this list like Pereira, like Topuria, who haven't even had 16 fights, and that's how many title wins Jon Jones has had. So overall, I think Jon Jones is the GOAT. Sadly, nobody is a fan of that. He is a steroid cheat, terrible person, but he's the GOAT of the sport. Anyway, like, subscribe, let me know what you guys think about my takes, and I'll see y'all in the next one.